Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the third and final chapter of the book of Nahum. And just to review, Nahum's name translates as comforter in original, and this is somewhat paradoxical as the message he delivers is oriented towards the destruction, but it was the destruction of one of Judah's most notorious enemies, and therefore it was a source of comfort to them. That enemy was Assyria, who had been harassing Judah, failed to conquer it. We can read of the event which occurred in 701 BM before Messiah in Isaiah's 37th chapter when Hezekiah was ruling. The angel of Yahweh slew 185 of them camped outside the gates of Jerusalem in a single night, and they did successfully subsume and scatter the northern king of Israel 21 years ago in the year 722 BM, but they remained a perpetual threat and a perpetual nuisance. Yet in the year 612 BM, they were obliterated by Babylon, and not long after that, they would consume Egypt in 598 BM and then Judah in 586 BM. But even though the force which conquered Assyria would eventually conquer Judah not long then after, it was a source of comfort and joy for the Judean audience, because this was merciless people who had inflicted terrible things not only on the Judeans but all of their neighbors. And the first chapter describes the causes of the fall. The second chapter describes the effect of that cause. It describes in detail the description of the fall of the city itself. And the third chapter more specifically pertains to the judgments that are inflicted upon them by Yahweh. The opening verse reads, "Woe to the city of blood! All of it is a lie, filled with plunder. The prey is not lacking." City of blood, these were a warlike people who engaged in species of systematic savagery to inflict terror on their neighboring nations, and they were notoriously dishonest diplomats. They had a reputation for snaring enemies into enemies they sought to conquer into alliances, because the temptation to be protected by their military might was ever present. Yet they would quite often betray those who had entered into such an arrangement of trust in them. And the fact is that can only last so long. So the genius of empire building must be a combination of not only military might, but diplomatic finesse. And they had filled their city with plunder. They were looters. They took everything. They didn't make a whole lot, but they, like many of the conquering nations of the ancient Near East, they were looters and plunderers, and the prey was not lacking. They were surrounded by nations, all of whom they sought to subsume, being motivated by a rapacious ambition for empire. The sound of a whip and the sound of rattling wheels, of galloping horses, of jolting chariots, all of these are instruments of warfare, which indicates that this militarily mighty people are going to have the military might of another at their very gates, and they will not prevail. And the New Testament passage, "He who lives by the sword dies by the sword," comes to mind. So they had finally reaped what they'd sown. The chickens had come home to roost, and they would cease to exist as a civilization and empire henceforth. "Mounted horsemen with bright sword and glittering spear, and many wounded, and a mass of dead bodies, and no end of corpses. They stumble over the corpses." Now, one of their species of systematic savagery was to stack piles of the skulls, the decapitated skulls of their enemies, and place them in their own cities and in the cities of others to send the message that this could happen to you. We are sadistic barbarians, and we are indifferent to age, gender, or anything else as to the victims we claim. So the mass of dead bodies would have been literal, and it is to Nahum's account. Jonah just doesn't give much detail about the extent or the details of Nineveh or the Assyrians' wickedness. It is primarily to Nahum, to whom we are indebted for that information. "Because of the many whorings of the well-favored whore, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations by her whorings, and clans by her sorceries, Now, one of the Assyrian deities that was prevalent in Nineveh was the god of Ishtar, through whom our word Easter is derived. And I think it's also mentioned somewhere in the book of Acts, but she was a fertility goddess. So who we believe in is invariably connected into how we behave. So the Assyrians, as a result of worshiping this entity, were governed by their carnal lust and their lust for loot and plunder, and the connection between sexual sin or adultery and idolatry. Even though they're linguistically similar in the English language, they do have a connection, which is explored most fully in the writings of Hosea, who at the direction of Yahweh took a wife, Gomer, who was a prostitute, and as a visible sermon and an illustration to illustrate to him the love which he had for Israel, and to see them go whoring or flirting or anything along those lines with other gods in specific violation of the Decalogue was how he felt. See, I am against you, declares Yahweh of hosts, and shall lift up your skirts over your face, and shall show nations your nakedness, and kingdoms your shame. So once you have an enemy like Yahweh on their side and he is determined to eliminate you, that's it. It's over and done. There's nothing you can do at that point. And he did give them a chance to repent through the preaching of the prophet Jonah, who came 150 years before the writings of Nahum. And so they were not completely estranged to him, and they were literally without excuse for living in a manner unbecoming of those who had known him and entered into relationship with him. And their shame, nakedness is a source of shame. We read of this early in the Edenic account in Genesis 3:7 through 9, when Adam is made aware as a result of his sin, he eating the apple from the tree of wisdom, he becomes aware of his nakedness, and he and Eve are immediately overwhelmed by a sense of shame and seek to construct for them feeble coverings made out of fig leaves, and Yahweh intervenes and kills a furred animal to make their clothes in Genesis 3:21. That's the original expiation, which is a theological term translating as a covering for one's sin. And I shall cast abominations upon you, and treat you as foolish, and make a spectacle of you. Now it is the height of foolishness to treat the things of theology as foolishness. That is to reap the whirlwind, and they reaped what they had sown, unfortunately. And it shall be that all who see you flee from you, and say, Nineveh is laid waste. Who mourns for her? Where do I seek comforters for you? Nineveh was quite literally laid to waste. So irrevocable and thorough was their destruction that it would be not until the year 1845 that archaeological excavation discovered that the city once existed, and they didn't have a genius for cultivating friendships, so there was no one who mourned at the occasion of their conquest, but it was a source of comfort for them. So that who mourns for you is a rhetorical question, as is where do I seek comforters for you? There are none to be had, none to be found. Are you better than No Ammon, who dwelt in the Nile, streams with waters are all around her, whose rampart was like the sea, whose wall was like the sea? No is alternately known or translated as the city of Thebes, which became the capital of Egypt beginning in the Middle Kingdom, and it was located in the southern part of Egypt. And Egypt had been for a while under Assyrian control, but sometime in between then and now being when this book was written, they had wrested independent control and eventually threatened the imperial hegemony along with Babylon, but Babylon assumed each of them in succession and emerged triumphant over them in the imperial struggle and the balance of power. Cush and Egypt were put together, were her strength, even unlimited. Put in Luban were her helpers. So these are locations of nations which had formerly been under their control. Cush translates as Egypt, and I'm not precisely aware of where Put and Lubin were, but by their adjective helpers, they may have been allies or engaged in some sort of commerce with them. Yet she was exiled. She went into captivity. At the head of every street, her young children were dashed to pieces. Lots were cast for her esteemed men, and all her great men were bound in chains. So once more, they reaped what they'd sown. They exiled their conquered peoples and resettled them and scattered them and mixed them throughout their vast empire. And what they had done to others would eventually come home to them. And their habit of dashing young children, they were indifferent to age or gender, and inflicting violence against their enemies, they would reap what they had sown, their young children who are helpless and innocent. And the unfortunate fact of war is that children and civilian casualties are unavoidable in them. So even though it was tragic for these children, they were visited upon, the sins of their fathers was visited upon them. You too are to become drunk. You are to go into hiding. You are to seek refuge from the enemy. All your strongholds are fig trees, with ripened figs, when shaken, they shall fall into the mouth of the eater. Now, their physical strongholds were at one point impressive and practical, but they are likened here to a withering condition, likened to fig trees past the prime, as indicated by ripened figs, and they are physically wobbly and lack substantial strength, in that they are shaken and immediately consumed by the eater. See, your people in your midst are women. The gates of your land shall be opened wide to your enemies. Fire shall consume your gate bars. These are not promises to rejoice in, but to mourn in. And they were completely indifferent, once more, to the identity or age of their victims, so their women would be treated as mercilessly as they had treated others. And I almost hesitate to say rightly so, but once more, the sad fact of sin is that innocents are often inflicted the consequences of the sins of others. Draw for yourself water for the siege. Strengthen your defenses. Go into the clay and tread the mortar. Lay hold of the brick mold. So he's advising them to make the preparations for the incoming siege and onslaught, but honestly, it's not going to do them any good, because once Yahweh declares your destruction, it's all but inevitable, or completely inevitable, 100%. It's only a matter of time. But being creatures of habit, they would naturally prepare their defenses for the incoming onslaught. There a fire shall consume you, a sword cut you off, eat you up like locust, make yourself many like the locust, make yourself many like the swarming locust. Locust is often likened as a figure or illustration of judgment, most extensively by the minor prophet Joel, and the classification of minor prophets doesn't pertain to the quality of message, but it's etymologically rooted in a Latin word, which pertains to the brevity or quantity of quantitative and element of their writings. So they are deemed so not because they are less useful than the major prophets, the so-called, those being Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, but because they are more brief in their accounts, and no word of Yahweh is any less significant than any other. And we do find many repeated terminologies throughout many of the minor prophets, and they're almost always connected to the wider Bible itself. You have increased your merchants more than the stars of the heavens. The locust shall strip off and fly away. Now their merchants or traders were comparable to locusts in that they came and went as they pleased, and they they stripped impoverished people through their rapacious appetite for profit, but they would reap what they had sown, and rightly so. Your officials are like the locust, and your marshals are like the great grasshoppers, which settle in the hedges on a cold day. When the sun rises, they flee away, and the place where they are is unknown. So locusts and grasshoppers are both insects, and inferior creatures as measured by the biological food chain. And so it's not a flattering association to people who had likened themselves to lions, as we read in the 2nd chapter, 11th and 12th verses. They had a natural affinity for lions, whom are associated with might. They were a militarily mighty people who who fancied themselves as lions on the geopolitical stage, but here they are likened to locusts and grasshoppers. That is a sure indication that they were not as mighty as they once were. Your shepherds have slumbered, O king of Assyria. Your nobles lie down to rest. Your people are scattered on the mountains, and no one gathers them. Shepherds would have been a term for leadership, which would have been more meaningful to an agriculturally rooted ancient culture than our own, but that is anyone in a position of spiritual or secular leadership. So the kings and nobles and to some extent merchants of any ancient civilization would have been likened to shepherds. Your injury has no healing. Your wound is grievous. All who hear news of you shall clap their hands over you. For over whom did your evil not pass continually? So their destruction would be irrevocable, inevitable, and total, and there would be no cure for their wound. There would be no recovery or restoration of the once mighty Syrian Empire. And that is a cause for rejoicing for all the adjacent nations with whom they had interacted. And the closing clause is a rhetorical question. For over whom did your evil did not pass continually? That means that all in their proximity were not only subjected to their evil and wickedness and atrocities, but consistently so. So the lesson learned is that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And any civilization that is devoted to the military arts to the exclusion of the finer elements of civilization is not going to last. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye-bye.